The wind screamed against the cabin walls, rattling the warped boards as if it meant to rip them apart. Snowflakes hissed through the cracks, stinging the young woman's cheeks where she crouched by the dying fire. She pressed her shawl tighter, rocking slightly for warmth, whispering a prayer that the storm would weaken before morning. Her breath smoked in the half-dark, drifting into the dim air like a spirit leaving her lungs. She had been alone too long. Loneliness had a sound, and tonight it was the shriek of wind against wood. Then, pounding. Not the storm, not the loose shutter, but a fist on the door. Hard, desperate, urgent. She froze, her pulse tightening. No one should be out in this weather. She thought of wolves, of bandits, of men whose eyes turned cruel in hunger. The pounding came again, heavy enough to shake the latch. She scrambled to her feet, a log in hand as a club. "Who's there?" she called, but the storm swallowed her words. The door burst open. A gust of snow-laden wind swirled into the cabin, killing what little warmth remained. In the doorway loomed a giant of a man, his chest bared despite the storm's knives. His skin was bronze beneath the frost, his long black hair tangled and rimed with ice. Scars ridged his shoulders, proof of battles fought and endured. But it was not himself he thrust forward. It was the tiny bundle clutched against his chest. A sound barely human escaped him, half a plea, half a groan. "Milk," he rasped. "For my child." The woman's breath caught. The bundle moved, a whimper thin as a reed trembling in the wind. A newborn. The tiny face was gray-blue, lips barely parting for air. Its small fists fluttered weakly before falling limp again. For a moment, she saw not the warrior but the baby, suspended between life and death. Fear warred with instinct. This man was Lakota, an enemy in the eyes of her town, a savage as the papers called them. He could kill her with one hand. Yet his hands shook as he pushed the infant toward her. The muscles of his arms quivered with exhaustion. His knees buckled, and he nearly went down on the threshold. She could not see hatred in him, only a raw desperation that burned deeper than the cold. She lowered the log. "Close the door," she whispered, though he was already sagging against it. Snow whirled across the floor, covering the boards. She took the baby into her arms, so light it seemed made of feathers and grief. Its skin chilled her fingers. Instinct, older than fear, rose in her chest. She sat quickly by the fire, pulling open her bodice with trembling hands. It had been months since she last nursed her sister's child before the babe died of fever, but her body still remembered. She prayed it would be enough. The baby rooted blindly, lips searching. For a terrible moment, nothing happened. Then, soft pressure, a pull, a faint swallow. The woman closed her eyes, tears burning hot against her cold skin. The sound was the frailest tether, yet it was life clawing its way back. Her heart pounded not with fear now, but with a fierce, aching relief. Behind her, the warrior had collapsed to his knees, head bowed, one massive hand braced on the floor. Snow melted and steamed on his broad back. His chest rose and fell with ragged breaths. She saw the scars up close, marks of blades, bullets, survival etched into him. Yet in that moment he seemed less a fighter than a man who had walked too far into grief and storm. His lips moved soundlessly, perhaps a prayer in his own tongue. The fire flared as she fed it another stick. Shadows leapt across the cabin walls, painting them both in flickering light. The baby suckled with more strength now, small fingers curling against her. The warrior lifted his head, eyes glistening like dark coals catching emberlight. He watched every motion, his gaze fixed not on her, but on the child pressed to her breast. The tightness in his jaw trembled, and for the first time she realized he might weep. She had not spoken his language, nor he hers, beyond that one word. Yet something older than language bound them in that smoky, storm-choked cabin, the shared knowledge of how close death had leaned, and how narrow the margin by which they had pulled life back. The baby gave a tiny sigh, drifting into exhausted sleep against her. She rocked gently, unwilling to disturb its fragile rest. Her eyes lifted to the man's again. "He'll live," she whispered, unsure if he understood. But he must have, for his shoulders sagged and a sound escaped him. Not quite a sob, not quite a groan, but something cracked open from the center of him. Minutes passed like hours. The storm outside howled and battered, but inside, the rhythm of the child's breathing was steady now, the warmth of the fire a fragile sanctuary. She shifted to lay the baby against her shawl, covering its small body. Her hand lingered longer than needed. Once, she had dreamed of holding her own. That dream had been buried when her husband vanished on the trail west, leaving her to whispers of barrenness, to cold stares that called her cursed. Yet here, against all reason, she held life again. The warrior stirred, his great frame swaying. She thought he might collapse fully, but he steadied himself on one palm, then crawled closer, inching as if afraid of breaking the moment. He did not touch the child, only leaned close enough that his breath brushed its face, as though to assure himself it was real, still alive. His voice, when it came, was hoarse, fractured. "Thank you." 2 words in her tongue, shaped carefully, offered like an oath. She said nothing, her throat too tight. Instead she nodded, eyes fixed on the child nestled between them. For the first time since she had been cast out into the winter, she did not feel entirely alone. The wind shrieked against the cabin once more, rattling the shutters and bending the door inward. She knew danger was not gone. Strangers in these lands brought peril, and men with rifles might come hunting by dawn. Yet in that fragile hour, with a half-dead warrior trembling before her, and his child warm against her breast, the storm seemed almost far away. A different storm was brewing, one not of snow, but of choices that would bind or break the 3 of them. The fire snapped, throwing sparks. The baby stirred faintly, and in that instant she realized something that chilled and steadied her in equal measure. She was no longer feeding another woman's child, not even his child alone. By her hands, by her body, she had become mother to it. And in the warrior's dark, searching eyes, she saw the weight of that truth already settled. The storm did not let up through the night. It battered the cabin with fists of wind and handfuls of snow, howling through the gaps like wolves circling prey. Yet inside, there was stillness born not of peace but of necessity. The young woman sat near the fire with the newborn cradled to her chest, her shawl wrapped carefully around its tiny body. The warrior rested against the far wall, his breath shallow, shoulders bowed, but his eyes never left the child. He looked like a mountain torn loose, trembling but immovable, watching life flicker in the babe with every rise and fall of its chest. The woman's arms ached, but she did not loosen her hold. Her gaze flicked often to the warrior, wary and searching. He was terrifying in size, muscles corded beneath the scars that cut across his skin, yet he had not made a move toward her. He simply remained near enough to guard them both from drafts, silent as stone. She noticed how his fingers twitched now and then, as if wanting to reach for the infant, but afraid of losing it all over again. It softened something inside her she had thought hardened forever. The fire hissed and spat, burning down to a red glow. She rose carefully, laying the child in a nest of blankets close to the heat. Every motion was slow, deliberate, as if sudden movement might shatter the fragile accord between them. She went to the woodpile near the door, but her stack was dwindling. She had counted on surviving the storm alone for a day or 2, not sharing warmth with a stranger and his baby. Her eyes flicked to the great bundle strapped across the warrior's back, now resting by the door. He must have carried wood through the blizzard, along with the child. She understood then why his body shook with exhaustion. Without speaking, he rose and moved to it. He pulled logs free and laid them before her feet. Their eyes met only briefly in the firelight. There was no word of thanks from her, nor from him for what she had given the child, but something unspoken passed between them. A recognition. A fragile bridge built on shared survival. She set the logs on the fire, coaxing the flames higher. Orange light filled the cabin again, warming the damp air. The warrior eased himself down near the hearth, close enough to feel its heat, but careful not to reach for the baby. His presence filled the small room, but not with menace. Rather, with a strange gravity that steadied the space. She realized she was breathing slower now, her fear receding, though not gone. Hunger gnawed at her. From a small tin near the wall she pulled a hunk of stale bread, rough and dry, but food nonetheless. She broke it in half. For a moment she hesitated. The piece in her hand meant for him, as though offering it might change the shape of their world. Then she placed it in the space between them. He watched her long and silent, then took it with a nod. He chewed slowly, as though each bite must be savored, each crumb a gift. She ate her portion in silence. The crackle of the fire, the whimper of the child, the grinding of teeth on hard bread, these became the language they shared. Night stretched long. The baby stirred often, mewling in hunger. Each time, the woman gathered it against her breast, rocking gently. The warrior would rise and move to the cracks in the wall or door, peering out into the storm, as if guarding against dangers the snow might conceal. When the baby quieted, he would sit again, closer than before, his dark eyes never straying from the fragile form nestled in her arms. Once, she caught him watching not only the child but her, something searching, weighed down by sorrow. She looked away quickly, unsure what stirred in her chest. She tried to sleep when she could, lying curled on the floor near the hearth. Yet each time she drifted, she woke to find the warrior awake, sitting upright, his back to the wall, the baby resting against his chest when it slept. He guarded them like a sentinel, though weariness dragged at him. Once she stirred in the half-dark and saw him bow his head low, lips moving silently in what she guessed was prayer. The sound of the storm muffled it, but the shape of reverence was unmistakable. She felt her throat tighten, surprised by the sight of strength bent low before something greater. At dawn, the storm had not broken. Snow pressed heavy against the door, sealing them in. The woman stirred the ashes, coaxing flame from the last embers. The warrior rose, silent, and pressed his great hands into the cracks, shoving the door until it opened just enough for him to step out. He returned minutes later with more wood, his hair and chest crusted in frost, his skin steaming near the fire's glow. He laid the logs at her feet, then took the child gently from her arms when she offered it, rocking it with a touch that was almost tender. It startled her, the sight of such strength softened by fatherhood. Something inside her shifted. Fear dulled to cautious respect. They did not speak, not yet. Their words were actions. She covered the baby with her shawl while he stoked the fire. He sat by the draft to block the cold. She shared the little food she had. He gave her warmth in return. Piece by piece, a rhythm formed, fragile but real. She had not felt a rhythm like this in years, not since the world had turned its back and left her wandering alone. By nightfall, exhaustion had painted shadows under her eyes. She lay curled again, fighting sleep, unwilling to trust completely. Yet her gaze drifted to the warrior, who sat with the baby in his arms, rocking gently, the firelight gilding the curve of his shoulders. He looked less like an intruder now, more like some battered guardian carved from earth and snow. She closed her eyes, but before sleep claimed her, she realized something that made her chest ache. She no longer feared waking to find him gone. She feared waking to find him dead, leaving her with a child she had no strength to save alone. The fire cracked. The child whimpered. And as her eyes closed, she knew survival had bound them tighter than any oath spoken in daylight. She had not chosen it, nor had he. But the storm had. And storms, once they claimed you, never truly let go. The storm thinned by the second night, leaving a muffled silence that pressed against the cabin walls. The snow still lay heavy, but the shriek of the wind had fallen to a low moan, like a tired beast retreating. Smoke from the hearth curled sluggishly upward through the cracks, its scent clinging to hair and cloth. The baby stirred often, its cries softer now, steadier, no longer the frail gasp of a dying thing. The woman cradled it close, the rhythm of its breathing echoing faintly in her chest. Each time she looked up, the warrior's eyes were on her, dark and steady, never straying far from his child. The silence between them was no longer sharp with fear. It had become something heavier, waiting to be broken. She knew almost nothing of him except what her eyes told her. The scars of a man who had survived battles, the breadth of shoulders that had carried wood an infant through the teeth of a blizzard, the exhaustion carved deep into his face. But knowledge pressed against her, unspoken, demanding voice. He had not come here by accident. Storms did not drive men into strangers' cabins without reason. She gave in first. Her voice was low, hesitant, as though words might startle him back into silence. The child's mother? For a long time he did not answer. Only the fire cracked, and the baby whimpered against her breast. Then he drew a breath, slow and heavy, as if each syllable cost him dearly. Gone. The word was shaped carefully, but the ache in it was clear. He did not lift his gaze from the infant. The woman lowered her eyes. She had suspected, yet hearing it was different. Gone. A wife buried in snow or earth, a life ended in the act of giving another life. She felt her own chest tighten, a hollow ache she knew too well. She remembered standing beside a grave herself, her sister's child wrapped in cloth, laid beneath hard ground, her own arms empty ever since. She stroked the infant's back, murmuring softly, not to comfort the warrior, but to quiet the echo of her own grief. She wanted to ask more, yet shame pressed against her. She was no better. Her own story was a husk she had carried too long, brittle with silence. But the weight of it stirred in her now, seeing this man bowed beneath his own burden. She did not owe him truth, yet something in his raw honesty pulled it from her. "My husband went west," she whispered, eyes on the fire. "Said he'd find gold. Said he'd send for me. That was 2 years ago." Her hands tightened on the shawl around the baby. "His people, my in-laws, they said it was my fault when no children came. Called me barren. Cast me out when he never returned." Her voice cracked, a sound she despised for its weakness. She stopped, cheeks burning. But the warrior did not mock her, did not look away. His gaze remained steady, as though he had been expecting no less sorrow from the mouth of any soul left alive in this country. The cabin sank again into silence, but it was different now. Not emptiness, but a space filled with grief laid bare. 2 stories crossing in the smoke, twined by loss. The baby's soft sigh cut through, reminding them both that life persisted in spite of it. When morning bled gray through the slats, the woman heard a sound beyond the usual hush of snow. Distant, faint, but unmistakable. Hooves. She stiffened, her eyes darting to the door. The warrior's head lifted sharply, every line of his body taut. He moved to the shuttered window, pressing an eye to the crack. Breath steamed from his nostrils like a beast scenting danger. "What is it?" she whispered, though dread already told her. He turned, his expression grim. "Men." The word was harsh on his tongue, bitten out like something sour. Her heart leapt against her ribs. She moved instinctively toward the baby, holding it close, though she knew arms alone could not shield it. "Riders?" He nodded once. His hand brushed the knife at his belt, the only weapon she had seen on him. Against rifles, it was little more than a shard of hope. Memories surged, stories whispered in town, men who rode drunk on hatred, calling it justice. She imagined them finding this cabin, finding her with him. In their eyes she would be no savior, only a woman tainted by offering mercy to a savage. She would hang beside him, if not worse. The warrior crouched, gathering what little he had. The child's wrappings, a pouch of dried meat, a bone-carved trinket that glinted in the firelight. He moved with the urgency of one who had run too often, who knew the sound of hunters. Yet his eyes flicked to her, pausing, as though weighing something unspoken. She understood without words. He meant to go, to take the child and flee before the riders found them. Safety for her, perhaps, if she was left alone. But her arms tightened around the infant. The thought of it leaving her breast, its warmth gone, carved a hollow in her chest that felt unbearable. She shook her head before she could stop herself. "You won't make it in this storm. Not with him." His jaw clenched. He spoke something in his own tongue, fierce and low, before forcing words of hers. "If stay, danger." "I know," she said, surprising herself with the steadiness in her voice. Her gaze held his, though fear clawed her belly. "But you won't survive out there. And I won't give him up." Silence stretched. The fire hissed, the baby whimpered. Finally, the warrior's shoulders dropped, a decision made not with ease but with inevitability. He set the pouch down and began to move the few pieces of furniture, angling them toward the door. A barricade, pitiful though it was. She joined him, dragging the broken bench to the corner, shoving a crate against the shutter. Their breaths mingled in the frigid air, the scrape of wood against wood louder than the storm. They worked without speech, their bodies falling into rhythm again. When at last they sat back, the cabin felt less a sanctuary than a trap. Yet it was all they had. The sound of hooves grew clearer, closer. 5, maybe 6. Her stomach dropped with every thud. She clutched the baby tighter, its warmth searing her skin like a brand of responsibility. The warrior knelt near the fire, sharpening his blade against a stone. Sparks leapt and died between them. His face was carved in shadow, unreadable, but his eyes flicked to her once. There was no reassurance in them, only a recognition of shared fate. Whatever came, they would face it together. Outside, the hooves stopped. Silence fell heavy, crushing, broken only by the distant snort of horses stamping the snow. Then, voices, rough and close. The woman's heart hammered against her ribs. She bent her head over the baby, pressing her lips to its crown, inhaling its milk-sweet scent as though it might be the last breath of peace she ever knew. And then the first knock came at the door, slow and deliberate, rattling the barricade like a warning that mercy had ended with the storm. The knock rattled the cabin door again, louder this time, sharp enough to send flakes of snow tumbling from the rafters. The woman's breath froze in her chest. She pressed the baby tighter against her breast, feeling its small heartbeat fluttering like a bird in her arms. Across the room, the warrior rose to his full height, the knife glinting in his fist, his scars etched deep by the firelight. His face was stone, but his nostrils flared with the weight of the moment. A voice cut through the storm, raw and mocking. "We know you're in there. Open up, girl. No need to hide him. You're sheltering a redskin. Hand him over, and maybe we'll let you live." The woman's stomach knotted. She glanced at the barricaded door, at the cracks of light spilling through the warped wood. Shadows shifted outside. 5, maybe 6 men. Their boots crunched in the snow, their horses snorted in the cold. She could almost smell the whiskey on their breath through the boards. The warrior stood motionless, his chest rising and falling, his eyes burning. He glanced once at her, then at the child. The unspoken truth lay heavy between them. Neither of them could surrender him, not after all that had been risked. Another blow shook the door. The crate wedged against it groaned. "Open, or we'll burn you out." The woman startled, her fear breaking into trembling resolve. She shifted the baby into the cradle of blankets near the hearth, her hands lingering as though reluctant to leave its warmth. Then she snatched the iron poker from beside the fire. Her heart hammered so loudly she feared it might betray her. She had never raised a weapon in her life, yet the thought of letting those men near the infant filled her with a strength that burned like a coal in her ribs. The warrior moved with suddenness, sliding a heavy beam across the door. He crouched low, pressing his back against the wall, knife ready. Outside, the men muttered, their laughter edged with cruelty. A lantern flared through the cracks, throwing their faces into fleeting relief, coarse, bearded, cruel-eyed. Then the door jolted inward. A shoulder struck it hard, wood splintering. Another shove, and the barricade shifted. The woman pressed herself against the cradle, the baby stirring and whimpering at the rising noise. The warrior crouched like a beast about to spring, his eyes narrowing. The door gave way with a crack. Snow gusted in, blinding, the storm rushing to claim the cabin's warmth. A man stumbled through, rifle raised. The warrior launched himself forward, knife flashing. The strike was swift, brutal, steel finding flesh. The intruder collapsed without a cry, blood staining the snow at the threshold. The others roared in fury. Shots cracked, deafening in the small space. Splinters sprayed from the wall inches from the woman's head. She ducked, clutching the child as the warrior rolled across the floor, dragging the fallen rifle with him. He rose, firing into the storm. A man screamed, then silence, one fewer voice in the snow. The storm itself turned accomplice, wind howling, snow driving sideways, blurring sight. The cabin filled with smoke and gunpowder stench, choking and acrid. The woman coughed, eyes streaming, but she held her ground by the hearth, poker tight in her trembling grip. She watched the warrior move with feral grace, shirtless skin gleaming with sweat despite the cold, every motion honed by desperation. A shadow lunged through the broken door, axe raised. The warrior turned too late, but the woman surged forward, swinging the poker with both hands. It struck the man's temple with a sickening thud. He reeled, dropped his weapon, then collapsed into the snow. Her arms shook violently, but she did not release her grip. She glanced at the warrior, breathless. His eyes met hers, wide, startled not at the enemy's fall but at her sudden fierceness. For an instant, something passed between them, a recognition that survival had bound them both to blood. But there was no time. Another shot rang out, grazing the warrior's shoulder. He staggered, blood blooming across his skin. The woman gasped, rushing to him, but he shoved her back with a glance, fierce and protective. "Stay!" he barked, his voice low, strained. He dove through the door into the storm. She heard the clash of bodies outside, the muffled grunts, the scream of a horse spooked by the frenzy. She clutched the baby close, rocking him though her own body trembled. Minutes stretched into eternity. The cries outside blurred with the wind's howl, until only silence remained. Then, footsteps. Slow, heavy, dragging. The warrior reappeared in the doorway, blood dripping from a cut across his cheek, his knife dark, his breath ragged. Behind him, the storm swallowed the shapes of fallen men, half buried already in the drifting snow. His chest heaved, his eyes blazing. He shut the door with a shove, leaning against it as though holding back the entire world. The woman dropped the poker and rushed to him, laying the baby aside. Her hands pressed against his wound, hot blood seeping through her fingers. He flinched but did not pull away. Their faces were inches apart, the firelight casting shadows across their strained expressions. She felt the tremor of his body, the raw power muted by exhaustion. The baby wailed suddenly, piercing the heavy air. Both of them turned at once, the cry slicing through the aftermath like a blade. The warrior's gaze softened. He let out a shuddering breath, lowering himself to the floor, his back to the wall. The woman placed the child in his arms, and he held it gently, cradling it with hands still slick with blood. The infant quieted almost instantly, nestling against his chest. The woman knelt beside them, her hand brushing against his as she adjusted the blanket. Their fingers lingered, neither pulling away. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside, another storm had broken, this one of blood, fear, and survival. She looked into his eyes, dark as midnight, and saw not only the warrior but the father, the man who had begged for milk in the teeth of the storm. A man who had killed to protect life, not to destroy it. Her chest swelled with something she could not name, both terrifying and tender. The fire sputtered low, casting the cabin in dim gold. She pressed her forehead briefly against the baby's, whispering a prayer too soft for words. When she lifted her gaze, the warrior was still watching her, a flicker of something vulnerable beneath the steel. In that moment, she realized the danger was not gone. The dead men outside would be missed, and others would come. But she also knew, with a certainty that shook her, that she would not let him walk into that danger alone. The wind howled against the cabin walls again, but this time it carried not just cold. It carried the promise of more footsteps in the snow. Dawn came slowly, pale light creeping through the cracks of the cabin, touching blood and snow and weary faces. The storm had calmed, leaving a heavy stillness, as if the world itself held its breath after what had been done. The woman stirred the fire back to life with shaking hands, her hair loose around her shoulders, her cheeks hollow with exhaustion. She glanced often at the warrior slumped against the wall, the newborn curled in his arms. Both had survived the night. That alone felt like a miracle wrung from frozen earth. His shoulder bled still, though slower now. She moved to him, a strip of cloth torn from her dress clutched in her hand. He did not flinch as she pressed it against the wound, though his jaw tightened. His eyes followed her every motion, dark and steady, but not guarded now. Something in him had shifted. He was no longer the intruder who had staggered in from the storm. He was the man who had fought and bled beside her, who had shielded life with his body, while she stood her ground with fire and iron. The baby stirred, a soft cry breaking the silence. The warrior bent his head low, murmuring something in his tongue, the sounds rough yet tender. The woman eased the child from his arms, gathering it against her breast. Milk came again, surprising her each time, as though her body, against all odds, had chosen life once more. The child drank greedily, small hands pressing into her skin. She closed her eyes, heart aching with a sweetness that was nearly pain. She was feeding more than a babe. She was feeding her own hunger for belonging, for purpose, for the child she had once lost to fever, for the love she had been told she would never deserve. When the infant had finished, she rocked him gently, her voice low. "He has a strong will." The warrior looked at her for a long time, then spoke carefully, the words broken but clear. "Strong, because of you." His gaze lingered on the child, then lifted to her, steady as stone, unblinking. She felt her breath catch. Gratitude lay in his voice, yes, but something deeper flickered beneath it, something that scared her more than the men who had tried to burn them out. She turned to the window. The snow outside glowed gold where sunlight touched it, but scattered across the drifts were dark mounds, bodies half buried by the night's wind. They would not remain unnoticed. Someone would come searching, and when they did, there would be no mercy for her, nor for him. "We cannot stay," she said, her voice low, heavy. "Others will come." He nodded once. There was no argument, no hesitation. His hand brushed the baby's blanket, as though reminding himself that the child was real, breathing, alive. Then he reached for the small bundle of belongings he had carried all this way. The carved trinket of bone, the pouch of dried meat, the tattered piece of cloth embroidered with faint designs. He held the trinket out to her, his hand trembling. She frowned, hesitant. "I cannot take this." He pressed it into her palm, his voice rough. "For, Mother." His eyes softened, the steel breaking to reveal something raw, vulnerable. He was not only naming her as caretaker for the child, he was naming her as part of them, binding her to him with a reverence that struck deeper than any vow spoken before a preacher. Her throat closed. She clutched the carving, feeling the smooth bone beneath her fingers, warm from his hand. No one had given her such a gift in years, not since her husband vanished into the West, and her in-laws had left her with nothing but shame. This token weighed heavier than gold. It was trust, it was belonging, it was recognition. Tears burned her eyes before she could stop them. She leaned close, laying the carving beside the baby's shawl. "Then he has two parents now," she whispered, her voice fierce in its quietness. The warrior's hand brushed hers again, not by accident, and this time neither of them pulled away. Outside, the sun climbed higher, melting the edges of snow, spilling gold across the bloodstains. The woman bundled the baby close, wrapping him tight against the cold. The warrior stood, unsteady but tall, his frame filling the doorway as he looked out at the endless white. He glanced back once, and in that glance was the question he could not speak. Would she walk beside him into exile, into danger, into whatever came? She rose slowly, her arms tightening around the child. For the first time in years, she did not feel the weight of being left behind. Instead, she felt the weight of choosing, of stepping into something new. She crossed the room, stood beside him at the threshold. Their shoulders brushed. Neither spoke. The answer was already written in the way her body leaned slightly toward his, in the way his hand hovered near her back without quite touching. Together they stepped into the snow. The cold bit sharp, but the sky above was vast and blue, the storm gone. The child stirred, fussed, then quieted again, as though sensing the steadiness of the arms that carried him. The woman looked once more at the cabin, smoke still curling from its chimney, the walls scarred from bullets. It had been a cage, a sanctuary, and a battlefield all at once. She knew she would remember it as the place where her life had shifted, where grief had begun to thaw. The warrior moved forward, his steps leaving deep prints in the snow. She followed, her own prints smaller but set firmly beside his. They walked not as strangers now, but as a family pieced together from storm and blood, from hunger and mercy. Each step forward was a vow, unspoken but binding. Behind them, the wind stirred, covering the fallen with drifts of white. Before them stretched the vast, unforgiving frontier, wild and dangerous. Yet she no longer felt the gnawing hollow of emptiness. She had something to carry, someone to protect, and a man who had already bled to keep them safe. As they disappeared into the brightness of day, the baby gave a soft sigh, its tiny fingers curled against her chest. The sound was fragile, but in it was the promise of tomorrow. She pressed a kiss to the child's brow, then lifted her eyes to the horizon. Whatever waited there, danger, judgment, survival, they would face it together. And as the snow swallowed their tracks, the fire of a new life kindled quietly in the space between them, as enduring and as unyielding as the land itself.